In the summer of 1839, a British trade commissioner named Charles Elliot stood on the docks of Canton and watched Chinese officials destroy over 1,000 tons of opium, dumping it into trenches of lime and seawater until every last chest of it had dissolved into the harbor. It took 23 days. Word of the destruction reached London months later, and when it did, the British government did not respond with a diplomatic protest. It responded by sending gunboats. Within 3 years, China had been forced into a treaty that opened its ports, ceded Hong Kong, and paid a staggering indemnity, not because Britain had been invaded, not because British soil had been threatened, but because a foreign government had destroyed the inventory of what was, in every functional sense, a drug trafficking operation. This is the story of how the most powerful navy on earth went to war to protect a balance sheet. Most people who've heard of the Opium Wars assume they were primarily about trade rights, about Britain forcing open a closed Chinese market in the name of free commerce. That's the version taught in most classrooms, and it isn't wrong exactly, but it leaves out the specific commodity at the center of the entire conflict, and what that commodity was actually doing to Chinese society by the time the war began. To understand how Britain ended up here, you need to understand a trade imbalance that had been quietly building for decades. By the late 18th century, British appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain was immense, and Britain was paying for nearly all of it in silver, since China had little interest in most British manufactured goods. The East India Company, which held a royal monopoly over British trade with Asia, was hemorrhaging silver at a rate that alarmed London. The company needed something the Chinese market would actually want to buy, something that could reverse the flow of silver back toward Britain. It found that product in opium grown across British-controlled territory in Bengal. The East India Company did not sell opium directly into China, since the drug was already illegal there under Chinese law. Instead, it grew and processed the opium under a tightly controlled monopoly in India, then auctioned it to private British and Indian merchants, who smuggled it into China through a network of corrupt local officials and armed clipper ships built specifically for the trade. This arrangement gave the company something valuable, a legal shield. The company's own hands never touched the illegal transaction, even as its monopoly production made the entire trade possible, and its profits depended entirely on the drug reaching Chinese buyers. By the 1830s, the numbers had become staggering. An estimated 1 in 10 Chinese adults was addicted to opium, and the silver that had once flowed into China to pay for tea was now flowing back out, at a rate that was destabilizing the Chinese currency itself, since much of China's monetary system depended on a stable supply of silver coin. The Chinese government understood exactly what was happening, and by 1839 the Daoguang Emperor had had enough. He appointed a formidably capable official named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner, with explicit orders to end the opium trade completely. Lin moved with remarkable speed and moral clarity. He wrote directly to Queen Victoria, appealing to her, somewhat naively, to end a trade he assumed she could not possibly know the full horror of. He blockaded the foreign merchant quarter in Canton, cutting off food and servants until the British and other foreign traders surrendered their opium stockpiles. And then, in that harbor at Human, he destroyed all of it, over 1,000 tons, a mass of contraband the traders themselves estimated at roughly £2 million sterling, an enormous sum for the time. Here is the detail that turns this from a moral crusade into a financial one. The merchants whose opium had just been destroyed did not simply absorb the loss. Charles Elliot, the same British commissioner who had witnessed the destruction, made a fateful promise on behalf of the Crown that the British government itself would compensate the merchants for their destroyed opium. Elliot had no clear authority to make that promise, and it committed the British Treasury to a payout it had not budgeted for and had no legal obligation to make, except that Elliot had just made it in the name of the Queen. Suddenly, the British government had an enormous financial incentive that had nothing to do with free trade principles and everything to do with a specific, quantifiable debt it now owed to a group of opium traders. The fastest and arguably only way to recover that money was to force China to pay for it. When the matter reached Parliament in 1840, the vote to authorize military action passed by a margin of only 9 votes, a remarkably narrow margin for a war that would go on to reshape an empire. Opposition politicians, including a young William Gladstone, argued forcefully against the war, with Gladstone calling it a conflict he did not know how to characterize without shame, given that it existed to protect a trade he considered morally indefensible. But the merchants who stood to be repaid, and the shipping and insurance interests tied to the opium trade, lobbied hard, and the war was authorized. What followed was almost comically one-sided. British steam warships, technologically decades ahead of anything China possessed, moved up the Chinese coast largely unopposed, and by 1842, the Qing government had no choice but to accept the Treaty of Nanjing. The treaty forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain outright, open 5 ports to British trade, and, critically, pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a sum that conveniently covered both the war's cost and, not coincidentally, the compensation Elliot had promised the opium merchants back in 1839. The treaty said nothing about legalizing opium. That would come later, after a second war in 1856, fought over similarly manufactured pretexts, after which the trade was finally formalized and taxed rather than banned. It's worth being precise about what this story does and doesn't prove. Not every British official involved was cynically motivated by opium profits, and many genuinely believed they were opening a closed, backward market to the benefits of global commerce. But the specific chain of events that triggered the war, a government promise to compensate destroyed contraband, followed by a war whose indemnity terms happened to cover exactly that compensation, is not a matter of interpretation. It's documented in the parliamentary record. The most powerful navy in the world was deployed, in significant part, to make a balance sheet whole again. The opium trade that Britain fought 2 wars to protect went on to addict tens of millions more Chinese citizens over the following decades, a human cost that dwarfed the original financial dispute many times over, and that China would spend the next century trying to recover from. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden financial history behind the headlines is what you come here for, consider subscribing to the discount window. New videos every week.